Okay then everybody, welcome. Good evening and a very, very warm welcome to you all. My name is Professor Frances Bowen and I'm Pro-Vice Chancellor for Social Sciences here at UEA. Thank you all for joining us for our first inaugural lecture in more than a year. I mean, the script says it's wonderful to be back enjoying in-person events, but I think that is an understatement of my excitement of feeling of being here with you all today. We used to say, I'm delighted to welcome you, but I really, really am delighted to welcome you physically in person. And of course, people who are joining us for the live stream and the recording afterwards. There's a whole group of you joining us online. I'd also like to welcome our speaker for this evening. I'll give a full intro in a moment, Professor Pieter Serneels, and the head of the School of International Development, Professor Laura Camfield, who will give the vote of thanks after the lecture. Now, a few words about our speaker. Pieter Serneels obtained a DPhil in economics from the University of Oxford. Before joining UEA, he worked at the World Bank, the University of Copenhagen, the University of Oxford, the International Labour Organization, and the Universities of Leuven and Ghent's De Vlerick School of Management in Belgium. Pieter has been a regular visitor at the University of Oxford, Universidad de los Andes in Bogotá, and the Research Department at the World Bank, among others. Pieter's research focuses on behavioural and labour economics, as well as political economy in low and middle income countries. He investigates topics to do with poverty and human capacities, which are at the core of international development. Pieter has published widely in leading journals in economics and in international development across fields including health, psychology, and political science, to name a few. He's an affiliate of the Evidence in Governance and Politics Group, European Development Network, and the Institute for Labour Economics. Pieter also provides research advice to the Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office and to RISE, a research program on systems in education led by American development economist Lant Pritchett. Pieter is a professor of economics in the School of International Development at UEA, and he co-directs our MSc in Development Economics. He teaches microeconomics of development and econometrics at the master's level, and also development economics, microeconomics, and the economics of education at the undergraduate level. So please join me now in welcoming Pieter Serneels in the flesh, today with us in person, to give his inaugural lecture. Welcome, Pieter.
Thank you so much for such a glamorous introduction. Not sure whether that's deserved, but let's try to live up to it. So thanks. I first wanted to maybe thank, well, the university, I guess, the audience. Thank you so much for coming. And maybe a special thank you to my colleagues from the school for providing such a stimulating and warm environment throughout the years. And in a way, I want to kind of tribute this, among others, to the school and the university. So let me first, the most difficult in such talks is to get your slides aligned. So give me a few minutes and we'll be there. So again, thanks very much. People online also, thank you. Can you hear me okay? Yeah? And online is also fine? Okay, thanks. So that's the title of my talk, and I'm going to dive in straight away because we don't have that much time. I'm going to talk to you about poverty. And I think, as many with me do, poverty remains at the core of international development, as well as, for many of us, economics. If economics is the science of scarcity, surely we must be able to say something about poverty. Now, poverty is changing. And I mean that in two ways. Poverty is changing because it has reduced substantially over the last decades. However you measure it, and I'm going to show you one measure, but however you measure it, you see a strong improvement. It's also changing in the way we look at it. And so I'll be talking a bit to these two observations. So poverty in developing countries has decreased substantially. Here is just a graph of some of the most comparable data, which is always the challenge. And you see from the 1980s to 2015, a strong decrease. Right? Again, whatever data you use, the slope will be different, but the trend is clearly there. It's a major achievement. And so in these dire times nowadays, someone has to bring the good news. I want to start with that. Right? We shouldn't forget what we've achieved over the last 3 decades. Now, all good and well, what does that mean? Well, it means that the profile of poverty is changing. It is now much more concentrated in rural areas, where it's often deeper. Doesn't mean urban areas don't know poverty, but the concentration and the depth is higher in rural areas and in conflict-affected areas. Right? So that's kind of a new profile of poverty. The thought many of us bring up is like, well, it must have risen a bit with COVID. If you look at the research that has been done, and that's true. There is a setback. But let's keep perspective. It's a setback of years, not even a decade. Right? So if you plot this, again, the most reliable figures I could find is, you see the projection from 2015, 2016, we have relatively good data. If you project it for 2018, 19, and 20, it would have ended up lower, but you see COVID kicking in 2019, and you see that it goes up again, probably to levels on average of 2015, 2016, right? So yes, we lost years, but we didn't lose a decade. Really important. And by the way, these are averages, right? So for some groups, it will be more profound than for others. Now, much of this poverty reduction, I'll come back to that, has to do with access to education and health. And possibly mental health. Although mental health is, we're so early in measuring this properly and across populations that we can't really assess this over a long period. But you see profound improvements in education and health, and many of us will immediately say, obviously, that's part of being poverty, right? Being poor in education and health, and that's exactly right. Now, this changing, the change in the incidence of poverty, as well as the profile, has led us to revisit poverty, to look at it in a different way. So there's a changing perspective. And I think there's kind of 4 things behind it that is forcing us to look again. One is to do with our view of humanity has changed, and this is especially for economics the case. Right? We've moved from a rational decision maker, seeing humans as rational decision makers, to human decision making. Can't find a better word. But it's basically bringing in psychology. We go from, well, we all decide pretty rationally whether you're poor or not, that was the old view, to we're all pretty ineffective decision makers actually. But actually, the poor pay a higher price for that. They don't have much margin of error. So for the same mistakes in decision making that we all make, the poor pay a higher price. And there's a debate going on, does poverty then cause ineffective decision making? Or is it the ineffective decision making that brings you into poverty? The debate is far from settled. It's hard to tease that out. But there's clearly an argument that both of them contribute. So that's the first movement. The second one is we're moving from poverty to human flourishing. And again, this is because we're bringing in psychology. Psychology in the 90s went through a radical transformation from focusing on the problems to focusing on the potential of humans. That's exactly what we're doing here. We're going to focus on just no longer the problem of poverty, but what is the potential and how can we live up to that? How can we help people to live their full potential? That's the kind of definition of flourishing. A fourth movement, I think, in the background over the last 20 years is that we've moved from static poverty analysis. We described poverty as in that society has this amount of poverty with these characteristics, to a more dynamic one. People move in and out of poverty. And then we're moving now to a more causal analysis. And it has to do with also our methods being better. We try to better understand the deeper causes from poverty, the deeper causes of poverty. And so, hand in hand with that, I would say, and in hand with these other three changes, is that we're moving more from a backward to a forward looking. And maybe this has to do a lot with also the climate crisis hanging there, right? We need to plan ahead. Both mitigation will be needed as well as adaptation. So how are we going to deal with more poverty where it occurs because of climate change? But how can we deal with it? How can we create more resilience? Right? So I would argue that these four issues really are changing our view of poverty. And the main message of this lecture, in case you want to leave or have to leave early, I'll give you the takeaway. The main message is like, well, there's a central place for human capacities, for health, education, and mental health. And so I see clearly a new field of research emerging that's been in the make for a few years now that really tries to take this serious and address this, learning from very different disciplines and methods. So I'm going to talk about investment in human capacities, how key that is, and how you can do that. And I'm going to do that maybe not to your surprise, giving examples from my own work, but there's a lot of other work going on by colleagues, right? Let me say a little bit more about what do we mean with human capacities. Basically, you can think of it, I'm coming at this mostly from an economic lens, but informed by much of the sciences and social sciences going on. So we talk about the skills and the abilities that allow people to flourish. Right? And so what you need to know, and many of us do know that, right? We are witnessing an enormous advance in scientific understanding of how human capacities form, how they change, and how they develop. And I'm going to give you one example. I can't elaborate too much, but I find this example very, very telling. It's about how brain science looks at human development. And you see on the axis here from conception, -9 months, to birth, and then you see expressed in months, on the x-axis, the months expressed, it turns to years, and it turns to decades. And so we're going to zoom in on early childhood development. And this is now mapped as like, okay, that's what we know. That's how we know the human brain develops. And you see when you start at birth, this will be familiar from most of us who are close to or have been close to kids and see kids growing, right? You see a development of first the sensory pathways, the seeing and the hearing. That then kind of develops pretty well, and there's a window where this develops. That's important. And then you go to another capacity, receptive language. There's no point in starting with it at age 0. You've got to wait a bit, but you can't leave it too late. And then you get to the higher cognitive functions, right? So that's kind of an accepted graph. It comes from a publication in the American Psychologist. So keep that in mind. Different phases have different stages of development. And so the skills that develop, we need to take them when they develop. We need to invest then. Because that's when any investment by a family, by an NGO, by a government has the biggest return. That's the idea. So, and I'm going to throw just a few words at you, not to whatever intimidate or impress, but just because these are the terms that are used in in this field, and I think it's useful to understand some of these notions in case you want to follow up and go to the literature. So people talk about a multistage technology. Basically, at different stages in life, different skills develop, and they build upon each other. They build upon each other, but there are critical and sensitive periods. The example I give to my students is, why do I speak with a foreign accent? Because I was exposed to a non-native accent up to age 12. And that's when the window closes. My brain parts, the connections between the brain cells are pretty set in that field by age 10, 12. Now, for some brains it's easier than for others. For mine, clearly it isn't. Or you need to do lots of effort, which I clearly haven't done. to get rid of it, right? But the bottom line is, your accent, very well documented, is kind of more or less set by age 12, 13. And so you have similar things for nutrition early on in life, language development, basic logical skills, and we're trying to map that out. It's a really exciting field of research. You have self-productivity, meaning like skills build upon themselves, right? And you have dynamic complementarities. This kind of gives like meaning to some of the old wisdoms, I think. Like, we'll think someone who has higher self-esteem may be better at school. Well, yes, indeed. The socio-emotional skills, which mostly develop during teenage years, if you get these right, as well as your basic arithmetic skills, you can do much better. Much better than if you only get one of them right. Okay, so that's in the back of our mind. And so if you can map this, what people are doing, then that allows us to look for a more optimal life cycle profile of capacity investment. When do we invest in which skills to try to have people flourish? For that, you need to map these technologies. You need to map the returns at each stage and then invest appropriately. That's a bit like the dry economic, almost government investment, NGO investment side behind it. Now let's give it a little bit more human meaning. On the x-axis, I plotted just these different stages, and I'm going to focus on the 3 core domains: health, mental health, and education. And I'm going to talk about 3 examples from my own work, but it's just because I don't have time to kind of do much more. Other people have worked in some of these areas also much more. So I'm going to talk about agricultural workers, adult workers, and health. How actually thinking seriously about their health, which it's an area I feel very strong about, we're not taking serious enough, can lead people out of poverty. Mothers of young children, and mental health, and then finally about primary education. This is me with my qualitative research colleague, and this is the comment we often get, like, oh no, it's going to be dry statistics. Well, it's true. You can do this in different ways. You can research these questions through quantitative or qualitative, and we did a bit of both. Right? I'm going to tell you more of the quantitative side, which is where I'm most involved in. I hope I can convince you that it's as colorful as the qualitative, but you tell me afterwards. It's actually not me, of course. I have to thank Helen for this slide. So keep in the back of your mind, especially if your mind works qualitatively, 3 stories. I'm going to talk about Sani, an agricultural worker in rural Nigeria, about Anna, a mother of a 14-month-old son in Colombia, and about Olive and Frederick, primary school teachers in Rwanda and Uganda. So first, agricultural workers. The question here, it may sound amazingly simple, but it's also amazing how little we know. Health literature has focused on nutrition, especially nutrition in early childhood, and much less on diseases from an economics perspective. So what are the returns to health investment in adulthood? The world has jumped to treating health in childhood for good reasons, but it seems we've forgotten something. And so we're going to investigate whether it increases income and productivity and by how much. A very narrow question to really build up from there. We focus on malaria, which is kind of after qualitative research in the area where we wanted to work in Nigeria, the primary concern, really. The setting is a sugarcane plantation in rural Nigeria, and the plantation employs workers from the surrounding villages for that season. And they pay them by piece rate, and that's important, because then we can see the effect on their effort, really. And I should say this is like an area with profound poverty. It's like 74% living below the $1 a day. So this is really their savior in the air, right? The earnings from this work. We provide together with the local university, so it's a team, when I say we, it's a team of group of researchers, including the local university, local NGO, and the plantation. And we provide a mobile health clinic at the workplace, And all we do is randomize the order of testing and treatment. So we go ahead with the normal intervention, with the normal healthcare, but we change the order. We randomize the order of workers. There's always going to be one first and one last. We just randomized that, which actually gave a very fair feeling to people. It's not a usual randomized control trial, which for ethical reasons we couldn't and didn't want to do here. So the question is, does access to malaria testing and treatment increase these poor people's income, labor supply, or productivity? And we find that it does, with 13%, or kind of in our data for a 3-week period, that's $13. Now that's substantial. That is almost $1 a day for people living below $1 a day. I should say during this period, during the period that they really earn a lot. And it stems mostly from a rise in productivity and also from an increase in labor supply. And this is going to have different policy implications. There's also an interesting twist. They choose the harder tasks. They can choose when they come to the plantation in the morning, what are you going to do today? Cutting or scrabbling? And if they feel better, they actually cut more, right? Because they earn more from that. Now here's the interesting sub-finding. Obviously, we found that those workers who are infected with malaria and then get treated, that they increase their income. In a way, that's a validation of the medical theory, right? Of the medical proven efficacy. But we also find that non-infected workers increase their income. So when you learn that you're not positive, your productivity goes up that week. And it's very interesting. When I told this before the COVID crisis, people would say like, nice, Pieter, but isn't it a little bit a coincidence, right? And now everyone says like, that's exactly what I had. I had a test yesterday, and I feel so over the moon that I'm not positive. So this leads us to kind of a deeper understanding of what providing health services does. It provides information. It helps people assessing their own situation. So it makes them in a way more, it gives them more agency. I'm going to move on a little bit quicker for the sake of time, but basically we find that it also increases firm productivity, although we can't totally claim that because we just work in one firm, right? So we do the before and after, and we try to think cleverly about what would have happened, but it's all within the same firm. It's kind of the project is clearly positive, the benefits exceeds the costs. So the key message is, well, this little piece of research offers a strong motivation to provide improved access to malaria care, which is not functioning in rural Nigeria. And it's one example of investing in adult health care to put that in a way back higher on the agenda. A side kind of finding is that it may motivate very well to provide workplace-based healthcare, even paid by the employer, because actually firm productivity goes up, right? Which is a really interesting side finding. So that was the example on agricultural workers. Let me take a second example, which is on mental health, and that's going to be about mothers of young children in Colombia. There's another part of the project that looks at young children, but I'm not going to talk about it here. Basically, we started to work on mental health because now it's recognized as a critical human capacity. But it's taken a long time. It's amazing how our thinking has lacked in this, right? And so it's particularly relevant for those where poverty is increasingly concentrated in marginalized, conflict-affected areas. And we go to exactly one of these areas in Tumaco in Colombia, on the Pacific Ocean, a space that is historically has suffered a lot from violence and violent activities. Now, mental health is also key for especially caregivers of young children. What the psychological literature clearly starts to find, empirically finds confirmation for what they thought for a long time, is the mother's mental health quickly reflects on the children. And so it's a key part of the environment of growing up as a kid and developing in a secure environment, right? So that was an additional reason why we chose this group. So the question, we're going to go very modest in this part of the research. How did COVID affect modern mental health in this fragile setting? And we're going to exploit, so to speak, a natural experiment, because our survey was rolled out over time with different subgroups, right? So we take group 1 first, then group 2, then group 3, and that order is randomized. Now, we did group 1 and group 2. We did the baseline and follow-up. We hit on the baseline for group 3 and 4, and COVID kicks in. So in that sense, it's a natural experiment that we can compare. Group 3 and 4, we have observations before and after COVID. And for group 1 and 2, we have full observations before. And through some assumptions, which you can test, you can see whether this is a good counterfactual for this and whether really that effect is causal, right? So that's what we're going to do. And we find clear, steep increases in depression, anxiety, and parental stress. And these impacts have been really quite big at the level of what people experience in conflict settings. A 14% increase to become at-risk anxious. A 0.05 increase to become at-risk depressive. And that's a much slower moving, which we know. And this was 2 months after the lockdown started. And a 10% increase in having at-risk parental stress. So these are averages. There's lots of heterogeneity, and you do indeed find that the impacts are bigger for the most vulnerable, those with less education, internally displaced people, and those with higher stress at baseline. The drivers we find, we can't claim this entirely, but the data is very consistent when you ask people with, why is this? Well, the biggest impact is where there's lots of lack of food and water, job or income loss, and family health, which is for many of us working in international development, sounds familiar, like the lockdown, the pain of the lockdown has often been stronger than the pain of the health crisis. Right? That we see here clearly illustrated and even manifested in mental health. The key message, poor access to mental health can be very costly, right? Both for the mothers and their functioning, but even for the spring off. So I'm going to jump to, summarizing so far, I think it's like, okay, we know that there can be returns to healthcare and mental health care. Now, what are the best programs? And it may sound like a dry economics question, but it's a real question. When I present this to policymakers, this is what they're interested in, because they only have a limited budget, and it keeps you awake at night what you have to choose, right? So we try to push this forward and help people think, what is the best? Well, of course, in many fields, you don't start from a blank slate. Sometimes that's good, sometimes that's bad. For early child development, maybe that was good, and maybe that's why we got so much of our early child development right, because there were no nurseries in much of Latin America. So starting with a well-informed model may be good. It may be much easier than trying to change primary schooling in some countries, as we'll see in a minute. But anyway, you need to take stock of what the existing system has. And you need to ask yourself, where, how, and why do these existing services fail? Officially, Nigeria has malaria care. Why does it fail? Why is it really absent in the area where we worked? And if there is something, how can we improve it? Right? So I'm going to give at least one illustration. I don't know whether I have time for two. Don't want to overwhelm you too much. But at least one illustration of primary education. And so this is moving to primary education first in Uganda and then possibly in Rwanda. Now, in primary education, the research is at a different stage, in the sense that there's been so much research to show that the benefits of primary education are profound for individuals, for societies. And that's why in the late 90s you see a swing in governments of providing free primary school education. Right? So we don't have to illustrate this anymore. That's kind of a given. So as a result of that, we've seen enormous progress in school enrollment, which is a good thing. But now is the next phase. Actually, the next problem shows itself, namely that pupil learning typically remains very poor. When you do tests with kids in primary school, it's tremendously disappointing how little they know in many settings. So here's an example of colleagues who did this across 7 countries in Africa, and I'm not going to go through this all, but the figures are really disappointing. In reading, in numeracy, it's far from what you expect a kid, this is 4th grade, a kid at 4th grade should be able to do. And so it was, this is kind of now, I think 15 years ago, then UNESCO came to that insight of declaring it a global learning crisis, because that's the current problem for primary education. So why are pupils not learning, right? And one aspect we zoom in on is on teachers, because teachers are crucial in the delivery of learning. Now, we try to think outside taboos, right? So this is painful for some to hear. I've been in presentations with policymakers, with union representatives, but you've got to also face the facts, right? So one possible reason is that teacher execution, as in doing their job, and performance doesn't live up to the standard that we think it does, right? And indeed, we now know that that's the case. Look here at surprise visits across these 7 countries. And you see the bars in blue. The dark blue is the absence from class. The light blue is the absence from school. So in Mozambique, when you unannounced go to a school and you have the payroll from the Ministry of Finance, people are paid and are among the better paid across the society to be there. You try to find them, they're not there. Some of them are somewhere in the school, but not in the class when they're expected to. Right? So it's a profound challenge, really depressing. But let's turn it into what can we do about it. And we thought for a long time, okay, these are figures for 2005-ish. Surely this is now known, this must have improved. Well, look at 2 countries for which we have data over time, Uganda and Tanzania. In Uganda, the absenteeism went up. In Tanzania, it fell by marginally anything. So this remains a problem, right? And so actual teaching time is much lower than the scheduled teaching time, right? If as a parent you know that, you might be reluctant to send your kid to school, and that's what you see happening in some of these settings. And this is an example, of course, I'm talking about education, but similar work has been looking at health works, and you find very similar patterns. So profound concerns. Teacher performance plays a role and is worrying. A second element is teacher turnover can be very high. This is insight from a colleague's study in Rwanda. He analyzed teacher turnover, and basically they find that 80% of the teachers stays in their job from year to year, but a big 20% changes. So that in itself may create an environment where teachers just get frustrated, right, and don't show up. So we're trying to map out this kind of, the reasons of why teachers don't perform. And I think I have time only for Uganda, so I'm going to go a little bit quicker here. In Uganda, we were invited to work with a local NGO to do the design in cooperation with the government to address this duality of problems, weak student learning and high teacher absenteeism. And at the same time, there was a law passed that tried to activate parent-teacher associations. So we all together came up with the idea of, can we do something more participatory, involving local communities in running the schools? So that's what I'm going to talk about briefly. I'm going to skip the Rwanda example. So in Uganda, what we did is we invited the school management committees to use a participatory scorecard. That's the idea here. And this is an idea taken from, a number of you will know this, from a setting in Bangalore where in the early 90s you had citizen cards, and an NGO designed these really well. And so it led over a 5-year period to actually a radical improvement in service delivery and an improved accountability of the local service delivery units, the clinics and the schools. So what is it going to be like? We're going to give a short training, a 2-day training to schools where we tell them like, look, when you assess how this school is doing, because you've got to legally come together every term, can you please design your own scorecard? You decide on a number of criteria, each of you walks around and you score the school for hygiene, for books, for materials, for a clean playground, these things. But you decide. And the other group we asked, here is a scorecard with the criteria set out. Can you please score them? So that's the standardized. Think of it as the kind of bureaucratic top-down versus the participatory. We randomized these two, which is going to help us to get causal inference. But the typical weakness of this kind of randomized interventions is that it doesn't shed a light on the mechanism. Right? So we're trying to do some qualitative research and some lab in the field work to understand the mechanism. More precisely, the mechanism, if our hypothesis was that participatory may work better. Why? Well, the literature would suggest there's 2 possible reasons. Because it may have improved information, people at the basis know better, or because there's collective action, people pull together to solve problems. And we're going to try to do that by looking at the difference in scorecard content between the 2 types of scorecard and to look at the willingness to contribute to a public good measured by a public good game. And so the findings is that I was ready that we wouldn't find this. But we did find this, and actually quite strongly. The participatory scorecard further improves, I mean, over and above the standardized scorecard. It has an improving effect on teacher present with 4%, not so high, but something. Pupil enrollment with 9%, pupil presence with 9%, and quite important, student learning with 13, not 13%, that's in standard deviations, which is a sizable impact compared to other studies. And we find that this stems from increased collective action, more than improved information. So we played a game, and it sounds like, oh, we just played a game. Well, it was actually pretty well organized, very formal lab setting that we brought to these schools, and we asked them to contribute to a public good, right? And so you see for each of the head teachers, parents, and management representatives, how they played in the standardized versus the participatory. And you see that the play is consistently higher among the participatory, right? So the key message here is, well, the participatory scorecard can improve outcomes substantially. And so we're now working, and NGO is actually working to try to study this more, make sure we understand the mechanisms more, and see whether this holds, because this is a relatively small-scale study in other areas before we do anything more with it. I'm going to skip Rwanda for the sake of time. You'll be happy to skip these graphs, I guess. So let me kind of gradually come to a conclusion. What are we, let's zoom out, right? Because I'm aware I gave you like snippets of things. Let's try to bring them together again. Think in terms of these human capacities over a life cycle. What we're trying to do is to map out where we best invest, because we know that some of these issues, some of these windows open and close, especially in education, right? But it would be helpful to think also about health more in that spirit. And so we find, summing up, that there are substantial shortfalls in human capacities. And that holds people from realizing their potential. Right? Appropriate investment can bring important improvements, and you've seen some examples. And there's plenty more. But which investment, which programs matter most? The policymaker comes back to me. I can't sleep at night. Did I make the right decision? I'm going to give you a taste of where we're going with this, because it's not an easy. If you would know the answer, I mean, it would be great, right? But I probably wouldn't be standing here. So it's a really profound question. And what we do see is, with a number of us thinking over the last, I think, 3-4 years, what we do see is something really interesting. The closer we look at the data, the more we see that incoherence within a system, think about education as one system, the more we see that strong incoherence within a system that delivers the services, that matters. So aligning, bringing coherence within a system is going to be key. Let me give a very, I think, deep and good example. Primary schools, where are we at with primary schools? We can do many interventions like the one I did, and that's indeed what's happening. How are we going to decide between them? Yeah? Well, we're now learning that instructional coherence is going to be important. What do I mean with that? There's 4 elements that we're finding that are really important for students to learn, and that is, what is the curriculum? How does that fit with what the teacher does in the classroom? How does that fit with what the pupils can absorb? And how does that fit with the tests, the assessment, the evaluation? And we see that there's just a total misalignment. And so maybe that's the reason why teachers don't show up, right? The curriculum is mismatched with what pupils can do, with what teachers can do. And the tests and the curriculum, often designed by the same ministry, but different departments, that's the problem, are not aligned. And so trying to align these came up as side discussions of these scorecard discussions, for instance, as a key issue. So that's what, I think that's the way forward now for a bigger change of like thinking about this system and where is the incoherence within that system. And this is exactly where child development got it right, because they had more science to go by from the beginning. So many of the child interventions now, the early child intervention, look at health, education, and mental health. Although mental health is still too absent, which is why we started working on this. But the best early child development programs both provide nutrition and stimulation, because one without the other doesn't help kids to reach their full potential. So I hope I've given you a taste and conveyed my enthusiasm, at least, for this development of a new field. I really think this is a new study field. I mean, I'm not on my own here. It's about how to strengthen human capacities to foster human flourishing. And why this is a new field is that it borrows from many different sides. There's a demand and a supply side. There's now wonderful qualitative research going on, for instance, ethnographies of systems of education. What goes wrong here? Right? What is the mismatch? But also on the supply side. It's system-wide, which is pretty demanding. We don't have the right tools. You might think like, oh, there's a traditional system thinking. Yeah, but it's really hard to analyze this structurally. There's going to be a system element and a program-specific element, and it's an ongoing search what the balance there is. It may also not be a universal answer, it may be very context-specific. And it brings together really several fields and several methods. I hope I've kind of shown that to you. I guess that's what I wanted to share with you, to give you a taste of a really exciting new field where we try to strengthen human capacities to really foster human flourishing, especially among people in poverty. Thank you very much.
faster to get as well. Right, so I can see that's going to be a very difficult one to follow. That was absolutely superb, Peter. It was masterly, it was clear, it was a fascinating synthesis of an enormous body of literature. And the clear policy focus, I mean, this is obviously what's attracted you to colleagues in, I haven't got used to DFID's new name, I'm afraid I won't even say it, but I mean, your secondment there has been very valuable to the school. And I think you also demonstrated the point that you made, that a good teacher is crucial to learning, because I feel as though we've all learnt quite a lot. So I'm the head of the School of International Development, or DEV as we call ourselves. My name is Laura Camfield, and I'd like first and foremost to welcome Pieter Serneels' family. This lecture possibly hasn't come at the best time, but I know that he's really valued your presence and your support, and it's so great for us to be able to celebrate here. I just wish I had access to some of the alcohol, which I understand you're enjoying in your living room at the moment, but later on, after we've had questions. So also welcome to DEV colleagues and students. I see some old profs here, I see some new ones probably getting some tips for their inaugural lectures. And welcome to UEA colleagues and friends, both within this room and worldwide. So I actually first heard of Pieter in 2007 when I joined Young Lives. And Stefan Durkon, who went on to become the chief economist of DFID, said to me, oh, there's this chap you might like to meet, knows a little bit about education, name's Pieter Serneels. I thought, oh yes, that's interesting. Well, now I think we know just how much about education you know, Pieter. It's been really great to have you share your knowledge with us. So what have we learnt? Well, I think I'm being a bit over-ambitious in trying to summarise what you've just said, but I'll have a little bit of a go. I mean, I think we got very strongly the central place for human capacities, health, education, mental health, in allowing people to flourish across the life cycle. That came across very, very strongly. And I think for researchers, the exciting potential of mixed methods, of interdisciplinary working to really understand how these processes work. So simple interventions, I think you really sold that to us. Work-based malaria treatments, scorecards seem to have an incredible impact. But the point that you made, of course, is that this is only when you've got an internally coherent system. And then your final point, of course, is that COVID-19 is very stressful. And I think we all agree that and can speak from personal experience. But you also showed very well the way that it intersects with existing vulnerabilities and that we need to be continually alert to that, to the new kinds of challenges that we have to respond to. So that message of systemic coherence, which we can probably also employ in our own working lives as well, I think is a very important one and a key learning that we can take away. But I'd like to hear some of the questions from the audience. So I feel we should throw things open for questions. I'll just check what... Yep. We've got about 10 minutes. So yes, we're going to do it old style, going around.
Shall I just stand next to you, so
yes,
because my memory is, I've got memory of a fruit fly, so I'm going to take in notes if needed. Yeah.
Yes, so we're going to gather some questions together, and Mark Zaytoun. Professor Mark Zaytoun, I should say.
Thanks very much, Peter. I really like the mixed methods that you use and the teams, the different types of teams that you work with. I'm neither an economist nor an anthropologist, but you said that ethnographic work could help sort of diagnose the systems. Just like you to elaborate on that, please, and how it would fit in with what you do. Thanks.
Should we take a few questions and then I can bundle them together?
Professor Arjen Verschoor.
Thank you, Professor Laura Camfield. Yes, Peter, that was a great lecture, marvelously clear and an impressive synthesis, as Laura said, both of your own work and that of others. So I was very interested in the combination of the RCT and lab in the field experiment. And then at that point, you found that the people who had designed the scorecard together afterwards, or in comparison with the other group, contributed more in a public goods game, suggesting that they had become more cooperative. And it made me think, how did you conclude from that 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 was the mechanism at work in the RCT, rather than they had been part of a team-building exercise and that made them pull together? But how did you conclude that that was the mechanism that led to the improvements in pupil learning and all the other good things that you saw in the RCT?
Great. Maybe one more?
Yes, two excellent questions.
Thank you. Professor Serneels. I have a very simple question, and maybe it's a little bit outside the box even a question, which is really simply, how did we ever lose a focus on human flourishing? Why is it that in 2021 all of a sudden we see that that is the innovation?
Thank you, Professor Schroeder.
Thank you. Wonderful questions. You can see why I love to be in the school, right? These are such good questions, fundamental. Let me take them in order. So Mark, an example is like a colleague of mine is looking at systems in education to really understand better these four elements. If you think about the curriculum, what a teacher does in class, what pupils can do, and what the teacher can do, to get a bit more qualitative flesh on that. Because it turns out that it's hard to measure this really carefully quantitatively, but from discussions with people, you see the teacher's frustrations, right? So I have to do this as a curriculum, but some of us are not trained to give part of that. And even if I try, I can't do this during this day because whatever reasons, right? And even if I could do it, my pupils are not ready for it. So what comes out of this kind of research is it's heavily inspired by an NGO that actually won an important education prize I think it's 2 weeks ago, Pratham in India. And what they've come up with is their formula is teaching at the right level. We're far too ambitious, as in like outrageously ambitious. It's like asking me to give a day-long talk instead of an hour talk. I'm not going to do well. I mean, keep your hopes up, but I'm not going to do well, right? It's a bit like that. And so they brought down through really careful, this is 10 years presence by local leaders to adapt that and to say like, we need to scale back and really stream pupils by what they can do and have teachers deliver to that. So that's an example where qualitative research, I think, is going to inform that, and then the quantitative research can test that formally. Does that make sense? Thank you. Thank you, Ariane, for this wonderful question that I hope would not come up. I'd hoped would not come up. I'm joking. But you're right. So, you know, I was wondering while I was saying that, do I overclaim it here? I think within the literature, it is the best evidence we have that this is a mechanism. Can I absolutely claim that this is a mechanism? For sure, no, but you need to think about the reason. It's extremely hard to illustrate mechanisms. Like, I've looked at some point, and with this we tried. This comes very close to a mechanism experiment. A mechanism experiment is really demanding because you don't have to randomize your treatment, you have to randomize the mechanism through which it works. And that's why it almost doesn't happen. It's a wonderful paper in 2012 written about it's really hard. So then the question is, well, how do we document mechanisms? The best way we can do it, second best, but it's the best, is theory. And that's why I put so much emphasis on there is agreement that participatory methods or decentralization work either through an information advantage or through a collective action. And so we do see at least evidence consistent with the collective action and not with the information. That's important. Now, would I totally stand up and say, like, can I totally exclude that this is absolutely the mechanism? I need a bit more certainty for that. But I would, it's not that through training we build collective action because we trained the others as well. The only difference was we trained those in the participatory card and those for exactly the same time with exactly the same instructions except for 1 hour difference that it was a top-down decided card, right? So that kind of team building we can exclude. Yeah. So thanks for that. Then about the human flourishing, yeah, wonderful. I mean, it's a great, it just shows that we have to remain self-critical as scientists because you get into avenues and you forget sometimes what it's about, right? I think in economics, this is due to psychology bringing in this revisit in psychology, the shift from problem-oriented to flourishing. We're learning from that. Yeah. And it's such a deep question. I don't have a better answer to that. I think it's a wonderful reflection. Yeah, thanks.
Right, so we have a few more questions, I think. Are these questions coming online? Excellent.
Hi, Pieter. This question comes from your online audience. In your research, have you looked at the implications of your findings through a gender lens?
Okay.
Are there any others from the online audience? Any others in the room?
This also comes from the online audience. What have you found are the greatest barriers to human flourishing, particularly with regard to mental health?
Wonderful. Let me take these two. The gender lens, great. To some extent, in some of our work, we sidestepped it because it does, for quantitative analysis, it does create an opportunity and a challenge, and sometimes you have to choose. You can't have all challenges together. So for instance, in the agricultural worker setting, that's just the male population. So we can't shed light on gender. In the Colombian sample, so I'm just going to talk about these three examples, right? In the Colombian sample, we focused deliberately on mothers. So again, the gender issue is not there. So that's why you don't hear me talking about that. These projects can't shed light to that. But let me tell you a little story about the primary school in Rwanda, which I didn't talk about. So basically, what the project in Rwanda is to look at how can we select the best, most motivated, well, ideally the most motivated, but the best teachers into the profession, right? How can we get those people? By offering like really attractive contracts that are framed in one way or another way. And so one of the concerns we had early on is that, you know, by letting people react to incentives to a contract, we know from the literature that men tend to be more competitive than women. It's kind of now, it's overwhelming evidence that that is very often the case on average, right? You can have deviations, of course. So we were really concerned of like, imagine that our program leads to more men selecting in. Where do you end up then? You have in Rwanda, it's not a bad situation, but still, the majority is men in primary school. You want more men? So you want even less role models for girls? That would be really eroding the gender balance of that setting, right? So we try to take this into account very strongly. And that's an example where we did that, so we adapted it to some extent, and we don't see any gender effect at all, eventually. And so we took out the kind of competitive appeal. So I can tell you about another program, but a project, but I can't say too much. But this is with a high-income country administration, where we try to look at the decision-making by policymakers through a gender lens. Why are, when women bring up ideas in a meeting, why are they followed through much less when the same idea is brought up by men, right? Comparative, so the ideas of women are followed through less. So we try to investigate that, but that's an ongoing project. Let me jump to the question on mental health. I think the greatest barrier is the lack of recognition. We're still at that stage. So we don't even have an infrastructure for mental health. There's no like mental health care for people in poor situations. But the basic reason is there's no awareness still among many policymakers that this is a key component, that the WHO has now recognized this for quite a few years as a key capacity, right? So I think that is what holds us back more than anything else for the moment. Does that make sense?
Excellent. Well, we should probably probably start drawing things to a close, unless any final waving hands suggest one last urgent question. Of course, you'll have a chance to chat to Professor Serneels over drinks outside. So I don't know if anyone needs to give some...
Yes, please. There seems to be a last question. Yes, wonderful.
Last question. Excellent.
Hi. I just wanted to ask, for human capabilities, it seems like it poses itself as an individualist approach. So does this complicate things when looking for solutions? And if it does, how do we simplify it? Because tools for me to flourish would vary from the next person's tools needed for them to flourish. So this might need individual access. So how do we simplify this in policymaking?
Thank you. That's a wonderful question. This is where you hit the limits of your own discipline sometimes, right? And you try to work together, but there is a kind of methodological, I think, a methodological code that has advantages and disadvantages. So in economics, especially the quantitative side, which is the vast amount, you start from typically individual agents, right? And so that's been the emphasis of my approach as well. But this is changing. And I think that is the next frontier of behavioral economics. We've now brought in psychology. The next thing is to bring in more insights from anthropology and sociology. And it is happening to some extent. I've worked on the role of aspirations. How do mother aspirations impact the school outcomes of their kids? And you can find associations, but it doesn't mean that it's a causal relationship. So you find kids who do better have parents who are more ambitious. Now, it's pretty hard to map out a causal path, and one reason is that aspirations are very much driven by the people around you, by what you see. So at that point it becomes in a way very sociological, and it actually uses insights from sociology. So basically it's kind of Appadurai pushed some of our thinking on you internalize what you see around you to phrase your own aspirations. And so I think this is an ongoing search, and it's absolutely right that this is an area for future research. Thank you.
Thank you for the excellent questions. I mean, your point about interdisciplinarity is well made, because as you were talking about the high-income country, and I couldn't help but speculate that it might be the UK, I was thinking there must be so much linguistic and feminist theory addressing that question that you can draw on. So, I mean, it's quite wonderful to be at the centre of such a sort of rich network of thought. And thank you very much for sharing that with us tonight.
Thanks. Thank you.
Drinks are that way. Don't all run at once. We need to preserve, COVID safety and all that. So, I don't know, Tanner, if you have any specific guidance as to... Right. Excellent.